All right, hey, so this is Neil again, and this was going to be my response to Drace's opening of the debate. One of the first things he talks about is kind of puts this emphasis on trusting our senses. And I think it's good that we can trust our senses to some degree, but it's not that our senses are perfect. Like, they can definitely deceive us and they can lie to us. So my physical feet touch the physical floor. That's one of the things that he said. Like, it's like grounded and we can like trust that there's a physical world there, but can you? Because do your feet ever touch the floor? Well, the answer is no. I mean, not any sense of one thing that's solid and unchanging and another thing that's solid and unchanging. They actually come in contact with each other. Rather, the atoms that make up your feet, the atoms that make up the floor, are really far apart on the microscopic scale. Like really far apart, like as far apart as maybe we are from the moon or something. And so there's interacting fields that are interacting there, like the electromagnetism of the atoms are interacting there at that level. And is that really physicality? I mean, I think that can be debated in of itself, whether fields are actually physical things. But the thing is, this also happens to me in dreams, right? In dreams, I also have senses. I see things, I hear things, I feel things, I touch things, I walk on the ground, and so forth. But I don't think that would be a good argument that my dream world is therefore a real physical world. Our senses can and do deceive us. Another point brought up is like the idea of whether or not we can know God, because St. Thomas Aquinas says that, God is kind of unknowable, negative theology. I don't quite totally agree with that. I mean, I agree with the idea in general that, we can't ultimately come to know God. But Aquinas didn't say that we can't know anything about God, because he argues for things that we can know about God, that we can logically deduce about God. So we can't know God as he is truly in and of himself, but we can still come to know things about God. It's like we can't describe exactly what fundamental things are, like gluons. What is a gluon in and of itself, or in and of themselves? Or a quark, what is a quark in and of itself? So we can't really even imagine what they are. Like, what is a quark exactly? Like, it's really hard to even imagine what that is, because it's really just kind of a mathematical idea. And so, yes, I think we can know things about God. But this doesn't mean that we can know exactly what God is. We might never know like what a quark is in and of itself, but that doesn't mean we can't know things about quarks, and so too it is with God. Like, quarks have colors, but this is an analogous word, and just because it's an analogous word doesn't mean it teaches us nothing about the quark. It doesn't mean that the analogy is somehow useless, because there's no real way to explain or understand the properties of quarks. So analogous language is good. The language is useful. I believe we can come to know things about God, such as God is pure act, which we learned from the argument from change, and then we can deduce other things based on that idea, such as God is unchanging. So God is mysterious in the sense that we cannot perfectly know God as he is in himself, but we can know things about God like we can know things about quarks, but we can't know quarks as they are in themselves either. Now, in a way, we are the reflection of God, made in his image. But what this means is like, think of God as a Platonic form of mind, and we are the imperfect expression of that. Another point that Drace made was how when a brain is split, and I think they sometimes do this surgery for people with certain kinds of epilepsy, and it helps them. But sometimes they get weird things like, alien hand syndrome, where one hand or one arm is like, has a mind of its own. It does its own thing. Like, there's this thing I remember reading about this woman that had that, and then she was trying to quit smoking. So one hand, she would quit smoking, not have the cigarette, and then the other hand would try to pick the cigarette up and smoke it. And it's like her hand that she's consciously aware of, she would try to take the cigarette out of that hand, and that hand would try to take the cigarette back. And that's kind of crazy. She's like fighting with her own arm as if her arm has a mind of its own. And yeah, this is an odd thing to happen, but this works for hylomorphism, because we are, as a human being, we are a body-soul composite. We rely on the brain as a human being. The totality of what it is to be human is to be a body-soul composite. And so the part of what we are is our senses. In fact, our senses is how we come to know things about the world. Another point he made was something like, well, if we can be united to fire, then why do we need like a body at all? Well, the thing is, we could be united to fire, but that only puts us in a sense and a place. It doesn't give us senses, right? It's not a true compatible item to the soul, that is the rational mind, right? We wouldn't be a human if we were attached to fire. So I think the point was, well, what's the point of like being in a body then if God can just unite you to anything? And although God can do that, it doesn't make you a human being, right? If we were united to fire, we still have no senses. We get our senses by being united to a body. We need the complexity of the human body in order to be human. The idea of being linked to fire has to do with like answering, how is the soul in hell? This was a question that came up like, okay, well, if the fire of hell is corporal in some way, but the soul is metaphysical, it's not corporal in any way, how can it be said that the soul is anywhere? Because the soul doesn't have spatial extension, doesn't occupy space. And if the fire of hell does, then how can it be said the soul is there? Well, God can divinely unite the soul to the fire so that it is there by relation of its unity. But we need bodies in order to have the minds that we have, in order to, well, not necessarily, but to have the senses that we have. So basically, God caused evolution to happen, the ultimate cause of all things. So evolution happens because that's the way God wants the world to work. And at some point along human evolution, we had a body that was compatible with the rational mind, the soul that God intended to create and unite with the body. And so basically, the more complex the soul, the more complex the body. Because it needs to be more complex for it to be united and for the soul to be able to express its full being or its whole being. Animals have what's known as a sensible soul. They have senses, but they don't have like a rational mind in the way that we do. And so they're attached to brains that are far less complex because that matches and is compatible with their souls. And so the human beings need a much more, complex brain structure to be compatible with our souls. So another point he made was like, why is the world so vast? Like, this seems to posit some problem for God's existence. I don't think it does. This actually points to the existence of God. We see the vastness and we think, how does this come about without any purpose? In fact, a lot of people make that very argument for why they think God is real. But yes, if the world were overly simple, then we might think, hey, this is made by someone. But then one could just as easily say, like, imagine that we lived in a world that was utterly simple and small. Well, one can say, well, look, if God existed, then he would create a world so vast that it would boggle our puny minds. And well, that happens to be the case. We live in that kind of world. So I think this question would still arise even if we lived in a smaller universe, because the question by an atheist might be, okay, but if God existed, then why doesn't he create a world so vast that it boggles our minds? And that's the kind of world we're in. But I would also appeal to my theodicy, which I don't have time to go into now, but God wants most of us to find him with some faith. If his existence were overtly obvious, well, then it wouldn't require us to search for him, and this is required for soul building. Another point I wanted to address was, the problem of evil. I go through this in depth in my theodicy. In fact, my theodicy is my answer to this, as it is. That's what a theodicy is. So in base, I guess in a simple way, I'll just say this: if God has greater purpose for suffering, then a good God would cause the world to be just like this. In fact, this is the most best perfect world that could possibly exist. And we would only realize that when we realize why suffering exists and that it's necessary for our soul building. And then a final last point that I wanted to address that he made was something about worldviews and how supernatural worldviews, there's a lot of them, or there's a lot of worldviews that kind of show problems with supernatural views. And I don't agree that there's good evidence that most supernatural worldviews are false. It could be easily argued for that panpsychism. There's different kinds of panpsychic models that are definitely supernatural models or supernatural worldviews. And I don't think there's good evidence against panpsychic models. So even if there's good evidence against, like, let's say, God or something, which I don't think there is, there's definitely not good evidence against panpsychic models. So either way, my point is that I'm not gonna agree to that. I don't agree that there's good evidence against all of the supernatural worldviews. Cool. So I actually still have a lot of time left, which is what I was hoping would be the case, because I really wanted to delve into some other things here. And that is, I wanted to take some time to kind of explore this idea of like mental states and, is mind just reducible to a mental state? Now, there are atheists like Justin Schreiber. I forget I probably should look up what atheist organization he ran. So yeah, he ran Real Atheology. I think he might actually he retired, I think. And I think he came back recently, so he might be participating in that again. But anyway, in one of his recent debates, he explained how he's a moral realist, so he believes that morals are real things that exist independently of minds. And he also believes that consciousness is something that exists as its own independent property. He doesn't think that consciousness can be reduced to physical stuff. So there are reasons even for atheists to hold these views. And one such reason might be this idea that, I know different people cover this idea, but like the Kripke argument, I think he has like a modal version of this argument. But the idea is, if the identity between mental states, like let's say pain, and physical states, like C fiber firing, were necessary, if it had to be necessarily the case that the pain that we're feeling, the pain that we're experiencing, this mental state, is one and the same as the physical state, let's say these C fibers firing, and if that were necessary, well, then it would hold in all possible worlds, every logically possible world, it would be the case then, because that's what necessity means, right? In this case, modal necessity means that in all logically possible worlds, if this were necessary the case, then it would be always true that C fibers firing would be pain, and pain is, that is, whatever the mental state is, that is, let's say pain, correlates with some physical state, and those two are identical. They're one and the same thing, and that has to necessarily be the case. It has to be true in every logically possible world. However, though, it seems that it's conceivable that pain could exist without C fibers firing, or vice versa. That is, you could have the C fibers firing, but the person doesn't experience any pain. Maybe he took some sort of drug or something that blocked out the pain, or he did some sort of kind of meditation and doesn't mentally experience the pain, but his C fibers are still firing. Well, this identity then seems to be contingent and not necessary. And this suggests that there's mental states that are not reducible to physical states, right? Because there's at least one logically possible world in which pain is not reducible to a physical brain state. That they're not one and the same thing, because it's not necessarily the case, because we can imagine it not necessarily being the case. We can imagine a world where this isn't the case, like I just said. So the fact that we can conceive of mental states without their corresponding physical states indicates that mental states might have properties that are not captured by physical descriptions alone. And this supports the idea that the mind could be more than just brain states. Now, I don't want to like make the argument like so definite that, hey, look, this is definitely the case then. It's definitely the case that brain or that mental states are not reduced to physical states. That's the argument that I think he makes, but you can make it less so. You can go, well, because it's possible, and like there's at least one possible world in which these things are not reducible, then it's possible that mental states are not the same as physical states. Now you can run, that modal logic all the way through it, and like if you use S4, it seems to be the case that it is true then in our world. But I don't think you have to go all the way that far. Like some people just don't like that kind of argument. They just don't agree with S4 or whatever, and that's fine, but you have to at least admit that it seems logically possible that mental states are not reducible to physical states, that it's possible mental states are their own thing. And so, if mental states can exist independently of physical states in some conceivable worlds, then there might be aspects of consciousness or mind that are non-physical. This doesn't necessarily negate the importance of physical brain states, but suggests that there might be a part of a broader picture. And here's just like a syllogism of this argument, and that is, if mental states are identical to brain states, then all aspects of mental states, including intentionality, must be found in brain states. Premise 2, mental states have intentionality. They are about things. Premise 3, intentionality, that is the aboutness of something, cannot be fully explained by physical properties of brain states alone. And then the conclusion of this argument is, this isn't Kripke's argument, by the way, this is a different argument. A conclusion, therefore, mental states are not identical to brain states. And I'll spend my remainder of my time just kind of going over this argument a little bit because I think it's quite interesting. It's related to the first idea that we just went over. So this kind of just takes it further, the idea. So if it's true that mental states are identical to brain states, and we already showed that, or excuse me, I should say, I believe I've already shown that we can at least imagine a possible world where a mental state is not reduced to a physical state. But if mental states are identical to brain states, then all aspect of mental states, including intentionality, the aboutness of the thought, must be found in brain states. So think about this for a second. Like if I think about something, like I intend to move my arm to pick up my PS5 controller. I'm only saying that because it's actually in front of me right now. So that wasn't like random. Anyway, so if I went to reach out and grab this PS5 controller, I have the intention to grab that controller. My mental state is about something, right? And it has this intentionality behind it. But where would that intentionality be found in brain states? Where exactly do you find the intentionality? Like, is it inside the neurons? Do they have intentionality about them? Are they about things? And it seems that they're not. It seems that brain states aren't about things. And so, but that would have to be the case if mental states are identical to brain states, or at least you'd have to account for this aboutness. You have to account for intentionality within a brain state and show how a brain state can somehow produce this intentionality, or what the intentionality is on a physical scale. And so then the rest of the argument is, it just follows that, okay, if we agree with all that seems correct. Well, then mental states do have intentionality. That is, they're about things. That just seems evidently true. I don't think I really have to give any evidence for that, unless you're a very different kind of thing than I am, and you don't have intentionality behind your thoughts, and then I don't know what you are because you're totally different than I am. But if you're like me, then you just are going to naturally agree with this premise. Okay, yeah, mental states have intentionality. Intentionality cannot be fully explained by physical properties of brain states alone. In fact, it seems that it just doesn't seem possible that physical properties would have any sort of intentionality behind them. And therefore, mental states are not identical to brain states. And in fact, I think people want to claim that, yeah, you probably can't find physical properties that have intentionality. And so they want to describe or explain intentionality by some sort of emergent property. But then that means, if it's an emergent property, that means that it's not reducible to the physical stuff in itself. And there could be other things that are accountable for that emergent property coming about. Therefore, mental states are not identical to brain states. And I'm going to spend this last minute I have left to kind of just flesh out this last point here in a little bit more detail. If it's granted that the aboutness of a thought, the intentionality of a thought, is an emergent property, well then it's going to be very difficult to prove or to provide enough evidence to convince one that has other evidences for a soul or something, or at least has strong reasons for why they personally believe in a soul. It's going to be difficult to convince them that reducibility reduces down to physical properties, which themselves don't have intentionality. And if the physical properties themselves don't have intentionality, but the thought does, and it's an emergent property, then it's easily conceivable that there's something else that's involved besides physical properties that are allowing for this emergence to take place, in the very least. And there you go. I'm going to go ahead and end it at that. So I'm a little bit early, 20 seconds early or so. Actually now 10 seconds. Thank you for taking the time to listen. And please go listen to his rebuttal as well, which I'll link to.